Garrett Kane was a dead man. He just didn't know it yet. He'd been riding for 3 days under a sun that baked the Arizona territory into a cracked red wasteland. His jaw was a hard line of stubble, his eyes the color of faded denim, and the revolver at his hip was as much a part of him as his own hand. He was a man running from ghosts, but in a town called Redemption Creek, he was about to run straight into a nightmare. The town was little more than a whisper of civilization on the horizon. A saloon, a general store, and a handful of sun-bleached shacks. Garrett swung off his horse, the dust of the trail clinging to him like a second skin, and pushed his way into the saloon. It smelled of whiskey and regret. He ordered a drink, the amber liquid burning a path through the dust in his throat, and listened to the low murmur of tired men talking about cattle prices and Indian troubles. Same story, different town. He was on his second whiskey when the shouting started outside. It was a chaotic mix of Apache and cruel laughter, punctuated by a woman's scream. A high, desperate sound that cut through the afternoon quiet. Garrett's first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 30 hard years, was to stay put. Mind your own business. Don't get involved. But something pulled him to the door. Maybe it was the ghosts whispering in his ear. Maybe he was just tired of running. The scene that met his eyes stopped him cold. 3 Apache warriors, faces smeared with the grim geometry of war paint, were dragging a young woman towards their horses. She fought like a cornered wildcat, her long black hair a whip against their faces, her dress torn at the shoulder. The townsfolk watched from their doorways, their faces impassive, carved from the same hard indifference as the landscape around them. This was the frontier. Mercy was a currency few could afford. Garrett should have turned around. He should have gotten back on his horse and ridden until Redemption Creek was just another bad memory. Instead, his hand dropped to the butt of his revolver. He stepped out into the blinding sunlight, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The warriors' laughter died as they saw him. The biggest one, a jagged scar tracing a path from his temple to his jaw, barked something in Apache. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. Garrett stopped 10 paces away. He didn't draw. Not yet. His gaze flickered to the woman. She was young, maybe 20, with eyes as dark and fierce as a hawk's. There was no terror in them, only a cold, sharp calculation. She was weighing him, judging him. Was he a savior, or just another fool about to make her situation worse? The scarred warrior shoved the woman aside and stepped forward. "White man, go!" he snarled, his English broken and sharp. "This not your matter." Garrett's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried across the dusty street with the weight of a gravestone. "Let her go." The air grew thick, shimmering with unspoken violence. The warrior's companions let go of the woman, their hands moving to their own weapons. The moment stretched, thin and tight, ready to snap. Then the scarred warrior smiled. It was a chilling, humorless expression. He looked back at Garrett, his smile widening into a predatory grin. "You want the woman? You fight for her." But this wasn't a challenge for tomorrow. It wasn't a formal duel. The warrior let out a sharp cry and lunged, a knife appearing in his hand as if from thin air. His 2 companions moved with him, fanning out, their blades glinting in the sun. They weren't offering a duel. They were offering a grave. Garrett didn't have time to think. His revolver was in his hand, barking once, twice. The first warrior stumbled, a look of surprise on his face as a red flower bloomed on his chest. The second one went down with a choked cry. The scarred leader, faster than the others, was already on him, his knife slashing through the air where Garrett's throat had been a second before. Garrett ducked and spun, the big man's momentum carrying him past. Garrett brought the barrel of his pistol down hard on the warrior's wrist. Bone crunched. The knife clattered to the dust. Before the warrior could recover, Garrett slammed a boot into his chest, sending him sprawling. He stood over the man, the revolver aimed between his eyes. The street was dead silent, save for the wind whispering through the alleys. The town was holding its breath. Garrett didn't pull the trigger. He just held the warrior's gaze. The man's eyes, filled with hate and pain, suddenly shifted, looking past Garrett at something behind him. A flicker of fear, pure, unadulterated terror. Garrett felt a prickle on the back of his neck. He didn't dare turn around. Not yet. "You should have stayed out of it," a soft voice said from the saloon doorway. Garrett risked a glance. The bartender stood there, wiping a glass, his face calm. Too calm. "They weren't taking her," the bartender said, his voice dropping low. "They were delivering her." Suddenly, the world tilted on its axis. The young woman, Ayanna, wasn't struggling against the warrior on the ground. She was standing beside him, helping him to his feet. She looked at Garrett, and her fierce, defiant expression was gone, replaced by something that looked chillingly like pity. The scarred warrior spat a mouthful of blood and dust onto the ground. He looked from Ayanna to Garrett, and a slow, ugly understanding dawned in his eyes. He spoke in perfect, unaccented English, his voice dripping with venom. "You weren't supposed to be here." He wasn't talking to Garrett. He was talking to Ayanna. It was a setup. All of it. The struggle. The rescue. It was all a performance. A carefully staged play. And Garrett had just walked onto the stage and shot 2 of the actors. He looked at Ayanna, 100 questions swirling in his mind. But her face was a mask, unreadable. Before he could demand an answer, a new figure emerged from the shadows of the general store. A man in a tailored black suit, looking profoundly out of place in the dusty squalor of Redemption Creek. He was flanked by 2 men whose hands hovered near the guns on their hips. The man in the suit, Silas, clapped his hands together in slow, mocking applause. "Well done, stranger. A truly heroic performance. Unfortunately, you've just complicated a very simple business transaction." Silas's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, settled on Ayanna. "The arrangement was for a quiet delivery, my dear, not a public spectacle." Ayanna didn't flinch. "The arrangement was that I would be treated with respect. Your men failed to do that." Garrett felt like he'd been kicked in the gut. He was a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. He looked from Silas's smug face to Ayanna's cold composure, to the wounded Apache warrior now standing with a posture that was no longer threatening but protective. "What is this?" Garrett demanded, his voice rough. Silas waved a dismissive hand. "This, my friend, is none of your concern. You were a means to an end, a way for this clever little thing to get out of a deal she no longer liked." He smiled, a thin, reptilian stretching of his lips. "She knew you'd play the hero. Men like you always do." The truth hit Garrett like a physical blow. Ayanna had used him. She'd seen him in the saloon, a lonely man with a haunted past written all over his face, and she'd played him like a fiddle. The desperate struggle, the fierce look in her eyes, it was all an act to trigger his protective instincts. The scarred warrior, whose name was Nakoa, straightened up, cradling his broken wrist. "Silas," he said, his voice a low growl. "You said nothing of this. You said only to bring her." "Plans change, Nakoa," Silas said smoothly. "Now, thanks to our trigger-happy friend here, the price has gone up. 2 of your men are dead. That requires compensation." His gaze slid back to Garrett. "And you, sir, have made yourself a liability." The 2 men beside Silas drew their guns with a fluid, practiced motion. The townsfolk who had been watching from their doorways vanished like smoke. Garrett's world narrowed to the 2 gun barrels pointed at his chest. He was out in the open, a perfect target. But then, the impossible happened. Nakoa moved like a blur, snatching the knife from the ground with his good hand and hurling it. The blade spun through the air, embedding itself in the throat of one of Silas's gunmen. The man gurgled, his eyes wide with shock, and collapsed into the dust. At the same instant, Ayanna kicked a discarded bucket into the legs of the second gunman, sending him off balance for a crucial second. It was all the time Garrett needed. He fired, the shot echoing like a thunderclap in the sudden chaos. The second gunman spun around and fell. Silas, his face a mask of fury, drew a small derringer from his coat pocket. But Nakoa was on him, a whirlwind of vengeful fury. He slammed Silas against the wall of the saloon, his good hand clamped around the man's throat. "You lied to me!" he roared. Garrett stood breathing heavily, his gun still raised, trying to make sense of the bloody tableau. Alliances were shifting faster than desert sand in a windstorm. He looked at Ayanna, who was now standing with her back against the water trough, her eyes darting between the fight and the open road out of town. "We have to go," she yelled at Garrett. "Now!" Silas, gasping for air under Nakoa's grip, managed to choke out a few words. "Kill him. Kill him and she's yours. The deal stands." Nakoa hesitated. The offer hung in the air, thick with betrayal. His tribe needed what Silas had promised. He looked at Ayanna, then back at the man gasping in his grip. For a heart-stopping moment, Garrett thought Nakoa was going to take the deal. He could see the conflict warring in the warrior's eyes. Then Ayanna shouted something in Apache. A single, sharp word. Nakoa's head snapped towards her. Whatever she'd said, it changed everything. The hesitation vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He slammed Silas's head against the wooden wall, knocking him unconscious, and let the man slump to the ground. Nakoa turned to Garrett, his face a grim mask. "Get horses," he commanded. "We leave this cursed place." Garrett didn't need to be told twice. He backed away towards the stable, his gun still trained on the unconscious form of Silas, half expecting more gunmen to appear from the shadows. Ayanna was right beside him, moving with a speed and confidence that belied her earlier performance as a helpless victim. Inside the stable, the air was thick with the smell of hay and manure. Garrett threw saddles on his own horse and the sturdiest-looking mare he could find. Nakoa appeared at the entrance, his face grim. "More of his men are coming, from the other end of town." They burst out of the stable and onto the main street, swinging into their saddles. Garrett glanced back at the saloon. Silas was gone. He had vanished as if he were never there. A cold dread settled in Garrett's stomach. This was far from over. They galloped out of Redemption Creek, leaving a cloud of dust and 2 bodies behind them. They rode hard, pushing their horses south into the unforgiving wilderness, the sun beating down on their backs. For the first hour, no one spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic pounding of hooves on the hard-packed earth. Garrett rode beside Ayanna, his mind racing. He felt used, angry, and utterly confused. Finally, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, Nakoa pulled his horse to a halt. They were in a narrow canyon, the red rock walls rising up on either side of them, offering some concealment. Garrett swung down from his horse, every muscle in his body aching. He turned to face Ayanna, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You want to tell me what that was all about? Or are we going to keep playing games?" Ayanna met his gaze without flinching. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair was a tangled mess, but her eyes were clear and steady. "It wasn't a game," she said, her voice low. "It was desperation." Nakoa grunted, cradling his broken wrist. "She speaks the truth. We were desperate." Garrett looked from one to the other. An Apache warrior and a woman who was his prisoner one minute, his ally the next. "I'm listening," he said, his voice flat. "My name is Ayanna," she began. "My father was a white man, a prospector. My mother was Apache. I grew up between 2 worlds, belonging to neither." She paused, taking a breath. "Before my father died, he found it. The thing men kill for in this land. A vein of silver so rich, it could make a man a king." The pieces started to click into place. "Silas," Garrett said. Ayanna nodded. "Silas was my father's partner. He cheated him, stole his claim, and left him to die in the desert. But my father was clever. Before he died, he made a map to a second, even richer mine. And he gave it to me." Nakoa shifted, his dark eyes fixed on Ayanna. "Silas has been hunting her for months. He wants that map. My tribe, we are starving. The buffalo are gone. The white man's army pushes us from our lands. Silas came to us. He offered food, rifles, everything we need to survive. All we had to do was bring him the girl. So you sold her," Garrett said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It was a devil's bargain," Nakoa said, his voice laced with self-loathing. "A choice between our honor and the lives of our children." "And the little show in town?" Garrett pressed, his eyes still on Ayanna. The screaming, the struggle. "That was my idea," she admitted. "When Nakoa's warriors found me, I knew I had one chance. I told them Silas would betray them, that his promises were lies. I proposed a plan. We would stage an abduction in the nearest town. I knew there would be a man like you, a good man who couldn't stand by and watch. I gambled that you would intervene. You gambled that I would kill for you, Garrett corrected, his voice cold. I gambled that you would fight for what's right, she countered, her voice rising with passion. I needed a witness, someone outside the deal who could throw Silas's plans into chaos. I needed a gunslinger. I needed you. I just didn't expect you to be so effective. So that was it. He was the wild card, the unpredictable element meant to disrupt a deal between two devils. He looked at Nakoa. What did she say to you? Back there, when you had Silas by the throat. Nakoa's expression hardened. She told me the name of the man who sold my people blankets infected with smallpox 10 winters ago. The man responsible for the death of my wife and firstborn son. His name was Silas. The silence in the canyon was absolute. The weight of generations of betrayal and bloodshed seemed to settle over them. They were 3 people from different worlds, bound together by a common enemy and a shared desperation. So, what now? Garrett asked, the question hanging in the cooling air. Ayanna looked out at the vast, empty desert stretching before them. Now we disappear. We find a place so remote that not even a man like Silas can find us. Nakoa shook his head slowly. A man like Silas never stops hunting. He will not rest until he has the map, and we are all in the ground. Running is not enough. Then what do you suggest? Garrett asked. Nakoa looked at Garrett, his eyes burning with a new fire. We do not run. We turn the tables. We become the hunters. We find this secret mine of yours, Ayanna. We take the silver. And we use that wealth to build an army and wipe Silas and every man who rides with him from the face of this earth. The sheer audacity of the plan was breathtaking. It was madness. A suicidal mission against a man with wealth and power, a man who had the law in his pocket. It was also the only thing that made any sense. Garrett looked at Ayanna. He could see the conflict in her eyes. The mine was her secret, her only legacy from the father she had lost. Using it meant risking everything, but not using it meant a lifetime of looking over her shoulder. The map, Garrett said, his voice steady. Where is it? Ayanna reached up and touched a small leather pouch that hung around her neck. My father was no fool. He didn't draw it on paper that could be stolen. She hesitated, then pulled the pouch over her head. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, but she didn't pull out a map. She pulled out a single intricately carved wooden bird. An Apache charm. It's a decoy, she said softly. The real map is in a song my father taught me. A series of landmarks, hidden in the lyrics. Only I know the way. Nakoa's eyes widened. A flicker of something. Awe. Respect in his gaze. He looked at Garrett. Your father was a clever man, and his daughter is even cleverer. Garrett felt a strange, reluctant admiration for her. She was a survivor, tough and smart, forged in the fires of betrayal. He was still angry about being used, but he understood the desperation that had driven her. He looked at the 2 of them, the vengeful warrior and the woman with a map in her head. This was his life now. Tangled up in a hunt for a silver mine, with a ruthless killer on their trail. The old Garrett, the man who drifted from town to town avoiding connection, was gone. He had died in the dust of Redemption Creek. A new Garrett stood in his place. A man with a choice. He could ride away, leave them to their fate, and try to find that quiet, lonely life he thought he wanted. Or he could see this through to its bloody end. He thought of Silas's smug face, of the 2 men he had been forced to kill. He thought of the ghosts from his past, the ones he had been running from for so long. Maybe the only way to outrun your ghosts is to turn and face them. All right, Garrett said, the single word sealing his fate. Sing me the song. The moon rose, casting long, skeletal shadows across the canyon floor. They built a small, smokeless fire, huddled together for warmth and a fragile sense of security. Ayana's voice was low and clear as she sang the song, her words painting a picture of the land. A crooked tree that looked like a dancing man. A rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear. A spring that ran red at sunset. Nakoa listened intently, his head cocked. "I know this place," he said when she finished. "The Dancing Man Tree. It is 2 days' ride from here, in the heart of the Serpent's Tooth Mountains. A place my people avoid. They say it is haunted." "It's where we have to go," Ayana said. They set out at dawn, pushing deeper into the wilderness. The landscape grew harsher, more formidable. They were 3 ghosts moving through a haunted land, each carrying their own burdens. Garrett, the reluctant killer. Ayana, the keeper of the secret. And Nakoa, the warrior seeking vengeance. They rode in silence, the unspoken tension a 4th rider between them. Garrett found himself watching Ayana. He saw the way she read the land, the subtle shift of the wind, the tracks of a lizard in the sand. She belonged here in a way he never could. On the 2nd day, Nakoa, who had been scouting ahead, came riding back at a gallop. "Riders," he said, his voice tight. "5 of them. Silas's men. They picked up our trail." There was no time to run, nowhere to hide in the open scrubland. "The canyon," Garrett said, pointing to a narrow split in the rocks a half-mile ahead. "If we can get there, we can make a stand." It was a desperate race. They pushed their horses to their limits, the sound of hoofbeats behind them growing steadily louder. They reached the mouth of the canyon just as the first rifle shot cracked through the air, kicking up a spray of dust near Garrett's horse. They plunged into the narrow passage, the rock walls providing cover. They dismounted, tethering the horses deeper inside, and took up positions behind the rocks at the entrance. Garrett checked his revolver. 6 shots. He had a rifle in his saddlebag, but there was no time to get it. Nakoa stood beside him, his broken wrist bound tightly in a strip of leather. In his good hand, he held his tomahawk. His eyes were calm, the eyes of a man who had faced death 100 times before. The 5 riders appeared at the canyon entrance, slowing their horses, wary of a trap. "Now what?" Garrett breathed. Ayana suddenly grabbed his arm. "The rocks," she whispered, pointing up at the canyon wall above the entrance. "They're unstable, all that loose shale." Garrett saw it. A massive overhang of loose rock, balanced precariously. One good shock and it would all come down. He looked at Nakoa. "Can you get up there without them seeing you?" A grim smile touched Nakoa's lips. "A snake moves louder than I do." While Garrett and Ayana laid down covering fire, keeping the gunmen pinned down, Nakoa vanished into the shadows, scaling the rock face with the silent agility of a predator. Garrett's heart pounded in his chest. Every shot he fired was one less he had. He saw Nakoa reach the ledge above the entrance. The warrior paused, bracing himself. He looked down at Garrett and gave a single, sharp nod. "Get back!" Garrett yelled at Ayana, pulling her deeper into the canyon. Nakoa let out a deafening war cry and threw his weight against the largest, most unstable-looking boulder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the rock began to shift. It was a chain reaction. The entire overhang gave way, and tons of rock and shale cascaded down into the canyon entrance with a sound like the end of the world. When the dust settled, the entrance was completely blocked. The 5 riders and their horses were gone, buried under a mountain of their own making. They were safe. They were also trapped. The silence that followed was profound. Garrett looked at the wall of rock that now sealed them in. Freedom and a tomb, all in one. "Well," he said, his voice hoarse, "that's one way to solve a problem." Ayana was staring at the rockslide, her face pale. "Nakoa," she whispered. There was no sign of him. He had been right on the edge when it all came down. Garrett's stomach clenched. Had their desperate plan cost the warrior his life? Then, a small cascade of pebbles trickled down from the top of the rockfall. A figure appeared, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. Nakoa. He was battered and bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but he was alive. He looked down at them, then at the blocked entrance. I have good news and bad news, he called down, his voice echoing in the canyon. The good news is, they will not be following us. And the bad news? Garrett shouted back. There is no other way out of this canyon. Nakoa paused, his gaze sweeping over the high, sheer walls that surrounded them. And we are running out of water. Their victory had turned to ashes in an instant. They were alive, but they were prisoners in a rock-walled cage under a merciless sun. The small amount of water in their canteens wouldn't last more than a day. It was a slow death sentence. Garrett slumped against the canyon wall, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving only a bone-deep weariness. He had survived a firefight, a betrayal, and a rock slide, only to die of thirst. The irony was so bitter it almost made him laugh. Ayanna slid down the wall to sit beside him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She just stared at the wall of rock, her expression grim. Hours passed. The sun climbed to its zenith, turning the canyon into an oven. Nakoa made his way down from the top of the rockfall, moving slowly, his body clearly battered from the ordeal. He sat with them, the three of them a small island of despair in a sea of silent, unforgiving rock. My father used to say, Ayanna said suddenly, her voice a dry rasp, that the desert always provides a way. For those who know how to look. She got to her feet and began to walk the length of the canyon, her eyes scanning the rock walls, searching for something. Garrett and Nakoa watched her, a spark of hope so faint it was almost painful kindling in their chests. She stopped at the far end of the canyon, where the wall was stained dark, almost black, and covered in a strange, hardy-looking moss. She pressed her hand against the rock. It's cool, she said, her voice filled with a strange excitement. And damp. She pulled her knife from her boot and began to scrape at the rock. Underneath the dark surface, the stone was porous, almost like a sponge, and it was wet. Nakoa's eyes widened. Spirit rock, he breathed. My grandfather told stories of it. Rock that weeps water. Working together, they chipped away at the porous stone. It was slow, painstaking work. But soon, a tiny trickle of water, clear and cool, began to seep out, dripping down the rock face. It wasn't a spring, but it was life. They filled their canteens drop by drop, the sound of the water a miracle in the crushing silence. They had water. They had bought themselves time. But they were still trapped. That night, as they sat around a small fire, the mood was somber. They had survived, but for what? To wait for a rescue that would never come? There is a story my people tell, Nakoa said, his voice a low rumble. About a warrior who was trapped in a canyon, just like this one. He could not climb out. He could not break through the rock. Every day he prayed to the spirits for a way out. He paused, staring into the flames. The spirits did not answer. Weeks passed. The warrior grew weak. He knew he was going to die. On his last day, as he lay waiting for the end, a great eagle flew down into the canyon and landed beside him. The warrior knew this was a sign. He gathered his last bit of strength, and he followed the eagle. The bird led him not to a way out, but to a small crack in the rock wall, a crack so small he had never noticed it before. Behind it was a cave system that led back out into the open desert. Nakoa looked at Garrett, then at Ayanna. The moral of the story is not that the spirits will save you. It is that when you have given up all hope, you must look closer. The way out is often where you least expect it. The story hung in the air between them, a parable of hope in a hopeless place. The next morning, inspired by the story, they began to search. They examined every inch of the canyon walls, every crack, every shadow. It was Ayanna who found it. A dark fissure hidden behind a thick curtain of thorny bushes, no wider than a man's shoulders. It was a terrifying, claustrophobic passage, leading down into the pitch-black belly of the earth. It could be a tomb, or it could be their salvation. The song, Ayanna whispered, her eyes wide with revelation. The last line. Follow the serpent's breath into the heart of the mountain. I thought it was a metaphor, but this is the serpent's breath. They had a choice, Die in the sunlit prison of the canyon, or risk the unknown darkness of the cave. It wasn't much of a choice at all. Lighting a torch made from a dead branch and a strip of oily cloth, they squeezed into the narrow opening, one by one. Garrett went first, his revolver drawn. The air was cold and damp, smelling of ancient earth and stone. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening into small chambers, sometimes narrowing so much they had to turn sideways to get through. Hours bled into one another. They lost all track of time, their world reduced to the small circle of light cast by the flickering torch. They were moving deeper, always deeper, into the mountain. Then, the passage opened into a vast cavern. The ceiling was 100 feet above them, bristling with stalactites that looked like the teeth of some colossal beast. In the center of the cavern, an underground river flowed, its waters black and silent. And on the far side of the river, they saw it. A seam of silver, thick as a man's arm, glittering in the torchlight. It ran up the cavern wall, a river of frozen moonlight. It was the mine. They had found it. But they weren't alone. A voice echoed from the darkness on the other side of the river. "I knew you'd lead me to it." Silas. He stepped into the torchlight, and he was not alone. He had at least a dozen men with him, all armed with rifles. They had found another way in. "A clever trick blocking the canyon," Silas said, his voice smooth as poison. "But my trackers are the best. They found this back entrance days ago. We've just been waiting for you to do all the hard work and lead us right to the prize." He gestured to the silver vein with his pistol. "Magnificent, isn't it? The source of my new empire." Garrett, Ayanna, and Nakoa were trapped. They were outgunned, outnumbered, with a river at their back and an army in front of them. "The girl," Silas commanded. "Give her to me, and I might let you two walk out of here." Nakoa let out a humorless laugh. "We have heard your promises before, Silas." "This is your last chance," Silas warned, his men raising their rifles. Garrett knew they couldn't win a straight fight, but this wasn't a dusty street. This was a cave, their cave. He caught Ayanna's eye, and in that split second, a desperate, insane plan was born between them. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "All right, Silas," Garrett called out, raising his hands. "You win. You can have her." Ayanna shot him a look of furious betrayal. Nakoa tensed, his hand gripping his tomahawk. Silas smiled, a triumphant, greedy expression on his face. A wise choice. "But first," Garrett said, his voice echoing in the vast cavern, "you should know something about this cave." "And what is that?" Silas asked, amused. Garrett looked up at the ceiling, at the thousands of stalactites hanging like daggers. "The acoustics in here," he said, "are very sensitive." Then he raised his revolver to the roof and fired. The sound of the gunshot was colossal, magnified 1,000 times by the cavern. It was a physical blow, a shockwave of sound that vibrated through the rock, through their bones. A deep, groaning rumble started, coming from the ceiling above Silas and his men. A shower of dust and small pebbles rained down on them. They looked up, their faces etched with confusion, then terror. The entire ceiling was coming down. "Run!" Garrett screamed, grabbing Ayanna's hand and pulling her back towards the narrow passage they had come from. Nakoa was right behind them. They scrambled back into the tunnel as the cavern behind them collapsed with a deafening final roar. The shockwave blasted through the passage, throwing them to the ground and extinguishing their torch, plunging them into absolute suffocating darkness. They lay there in the dark, hearts pounding, listening to the last rumbles of the collapsing cave. Silas, his men, the silver mine, all of it buried forever under 1,000,000 tons of rock. They had won. They had survived. And now, they had to find their way out of a pitch-black labyrinth deep in the heart of a mountain. The darkness was total, a physical presence that pressed in on all sides. For a long moment, nobody moved, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing. Garrett felt a surge of pure panic, a claustrophobic terror he hadn't felt since being buried in rubble during the war. He pushed it down, forcing himself to think. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, his voice sounding small and thin in the immense blackness. He heard Ayanna's voice near his ear. "I'm here." Then Nakoa's gruff confirmation. Slowly, carefully, they got to their feet. There was no way to go back. Their only option was to go forward, deeper into the unknown. They joined hands, a human chain against the oppressive dark, and began to shuffle forward, one foot in front of the other. Garrett led the way, his free hand outstretched, feeling along the cold, damp rock wall. Time ceased to have meaning. It could have been hours or days. They walked in a silence born of exhaustion and a dwindling, desperate hope. The only sounds were their shuffling feet and the steady drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Just as Garrett was starting to believe they would die in this cold, black tomb, he felt a change in the air, a faint, almost imperceptible current of wind on his face. It smelled different, not of damp stone, but of pine and dust and open space. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. Hope, sharp and painful, shot through him. They moved faster, stumbling over unseen rocks, their hands still linked. The passage began to slope upwards. The draft grew stronger. And then, far ahead, they saw it. A tiny pinprick of light. They broke into a stumbling run, crying out with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The pinprick grew, becoming a gray slit, then a sliver of impossible blue sky. They burst out of a crack in a rock face and fell onto a sun-drenched ledge, blinking against the painful, beautiful light. They were high on the side of the mountain, the entire territory spread out below them like a map. They were alive. They were free. For a long time, they just lay there, breathing in the clean mountain air, feeling the warmth of the sun on their faces. They had walked through the belly of the beast and come out the other side. Nakoa was the first to rise. He looked out at the vast expanse, his face unreadable. He had his vengeance. Silas was dead, but his people were still starving. The silver was gone, buried forever. He turned to Garrett and Ayanna. "The world owes you both a debt," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And so do I." He unfastened the leather pouch from around his neck, the pouch that had once held the wooden bird decoy, and handed it to Garrett. Inside were a few pieces of dried meat and a fire-starting kit. "It is not much, but it will help you on your way." "Where will you go?" Ayanna asked. "Back to my people," he said, "to tell them we must find a new way, a way that does not involve deals with devils." He met Garrett's eyes, a look of profound, hard-won respect passing between them. "Live well, Garrett Kane." Without another word, he turned and began the long, difficult climb down the mountain, a solitary figure moving with unshakable purpose. Garrett and Ayanna stood on the ledge, watching him go until he was just a speck in the distance. They were alone now, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a future that was a complete, terrifying blank. Garrett looked at her, at the woman who had used him, saved him, and dragged him through hell. The anger he had felt was gone, burned away in the chaos and replaced by something else. A deep, quiet respect, a connection forged in fire and darkness. "So," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "no more silver, no more map. What do we do now?" Ayanna smiled back, and it was like the sun breaking through the clouds. "I don't know," she said. "For the first time in my life, I have no plan. I am completely, absolutely free." She stepped closer to him, her dark eyes searching his. "What about you, Garrett Kane? Are you going to go back to drifting?" He thought about the lonely man he had been, the man who believed connections were a weakness. He looked at the endless horizon, at the promise of 1,000 roads leading to 1,000 different towns. The thought of walking them alone now felt empty, unbearable. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers laced with his, a perfect fit. "No," he said, his voice filled with a certainty that came from the very core of his being. "I think my drifting days are over." Together, they turned and began to make their way down the mountain, not towards any town or destination, but simply west, towards the setting sun. Their journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. What a story, right? A journey of betrayal, survival, and a final, explosive act of justice. It just goes to show you that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't silver buried in a mountain, but but the courage you find in the darkest of places. If you enjoyed this ride through the Wild West, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss where the trail takes us next.